today is the role of civil society in developing a sense of imagined community, of nation in Indonesia, okay? So you all listened to my YouTube lecture, right? So where are we at in 1870 in Indonesia? Where are we at?
Dutch colonization.
Still got a Dutch colony, yeah? The Dutch are in this process. They started this process from being just a few isolated trading posts. It was so isolated before that some historians refused to call it a colony until 1870. Indonesians like to say we were colonised for 500 years. Some historians say, no, sorry, but before that it was just a few Europeans with their factories, basically what factory means trading posts, with their trading posts making deals with local rulers. It's only after 1870 that you start to get intense territorial control. And of course, to put it in an Asian context, this is the time when England's starting to make more inroads into China, starting to make more territorial control over Malaysia. What's happening in the Philippines? American colony, excellent. We're going from a Spanish, excellent. We're going from a Spanish to American colony. Vietnam, Cambodia, what will become Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, which is now just called Indochina, is that who's starting to take control there? The French, right? This period, basically European powers are dividing up the whole map of Asia. Japan's gone Meiji seclusion, coming out of the seclusion period, and is now modernising by itself. So is Thailand. Thailand and Japan managed to keep the colonisers out. China, unluckily, is having the English and other colonies trying to tell them what to do. Vietnam's got the French to deal with. What will become the Philippines has got the Americans. What will become Indonesia's got the Dutch. What will become Malaysia's got the British. What will become Burma's got the British. Now I say what will become, because right now somebody sitting in, so if we're in 1870, somebody sitting in Batavia does not think of the person down the road even, the Chinese person down the road, or the Dutch person on the other side of the road, or the mixed person, the Eurasian person. Mixed means half, let's say, half Chinese, half Indonesian, or half Dutch, half Chinese, or half whatever, as belonging to the same nation right now. Okay? That's a ludicrous concept, ridiculous idea. They're clearly different. Clearly different. In fact, as we'll see, Chinese people in Jakarta probably think more in common with people in what was then called, in English, Peking or Beijing than they did with the person down the street. So it's all what Asian countries are doing in the face of modernity. That Asian people are either contributing to what it is to be modern, but are also experiencing modernity as something that's being forced upon them from the outside too. They're modernising in their own way, particularly in Japan and Thailand, but also being forced to modernise in different ways by the colonisers. And it's not an issue before, in many parts of Asia, it's not an issue before 1870, and in almost all of Asia, it's not an issue before even 1800. Suddenly, there's a new world to deal with. Before, there's this little sailing ships coming in with these big muskets and cannons that probably, if you were trying to shoot me from there, you'd probably miss. You'd be better off with a spear or with a bow and arrow. But after about 1850, 1860, 1870, new technologies of steel are changing the entire world. Those technologies are like railroads, steam engines driving the trains, the Suez Canal, steamships taking vast quantities of products like tobacco, tea, sugar from Asia to Europe. New guns that suddenly can work over 300 or 400 meters, which means complete obliteration in the colonial wars, for example, in Indonesia, the Dutch just routed these people with the new technologies. So suddenly it's right in your face. There's telegraph, beaming, not beaming, what's the word for a telegraph? Not beeping, but beeping information from one side of the globe to the other. Suddenly it's confronting. There are printing presses for the first time. We've had printing presses, China first, then taken up in Europe, but new mechanical printing presses really only starting to change the shape of Asia in the 1800s. It's all happening. If you think now is a pretty exciting time to leave, it's nothing compared to what it would have been like in 1870. The world's changing, and you have to reinterpret what it is to be me. Who am I? If you're sitting in the Philippines, and it's going to be important now, at this period in the 1870s, the most important people are these so-called Eurasian people, these mixture people. In Indonesia, in the Philippines, it's called the mestizos, the half sort of Chinese, half local people who are part of this new, they're called the ilustrados, the enlightened ones, who are starting to have this ferment, this idea, I'm not Chinese, I'm not an indigenous person, I'm a Filipino. For the very first time, it's happening in the 1800s, okay? The very first time. You can't go to somebody in the 1700s and say, you're Filipino, you're an Indonesian, you're Vietnamese, you're Chinese even would be a ridiculous idea. If you meant Chinese as in the same as that emperor over there, that's a ridiculous idea. So from the 1870s on, people are starting to say, I'm part of a nation. They're already doing that in France and America for about 100 years now. We've been doing it in South America for about 50, 70 years now. But now Asians are being forced to deal with this. They'd rather not, quite frankly, I think, but they can't avoid it now. So you have a colony this is what we call a plural colony. There's a group of Totok, it's a terrible word, I've just used pure. Totok, which means pure Dutch. These are like, according to Steinberg, a club of aliens. These elite rulers, they're Protestants, they're racist, they feel they're superior to everybody. You have what's called Peranakan. Peranakan, does anybody speak Indonesian here? Anak means child, Peranakan means mixed Dutch. Eurasians, at all levels of society. Now, because you've got steamships shooting people all around Asia now for the first time, and China's going through a terrible period of famine, of internal strife, terrible period. Chinese, particularly from the southeast, are spreading out all over the Pacific, to America in the gold rushes, to South America, to Australia for the gold rushes here, and to Asia. And it's these steamships that can suddenly take thousands upon thousands. And the population increases 5 times over of Chinese in Indonesia, in the Indies colony. These are both Totok, pure, and Peranakan, mixed. By today's standards, these terms seem quite racist, but this was a racist society, and this was the way people identified, okay? Totok, pure, Peranakan, mixed. So you've got Totok and Peranakan Dutch, Totok and Peranakan Chinese. You've got indigenous societies, you've got large kingdoms, small groups of hunter-gatherers. You've got Hindu Buddhist religion, you've got Christians who have been converted by the missionaries. You've got animist societies that believe in spirits in the trees. You've got Islamic societies. You've got societies huge societies, civilizations that have wet rice agriculture. You have swing societies out in the forest, and deep in the forest you have hunter-gatherer societies that have limited contact with the rest of the world. You have literate societies, you have non-literate or pre-literate societies where people don't have writing. In other words, you've got a huge variety of societies, none of which, again, none of these people think of themselves as Indonesian. Again, in 1870, it's a ridiculous idea. The word, I don't think the word orang Indonesia, orang person Indonesia, clearly, would make any sense to them. What the hell are you talking about? So sometime between 1870 and 1945, when Indonesia declares independence, over 80 years, there's got to be a radical change in the way people think. Okay? It had to happen in different countries. In Australia, it happened around the 1890s. Similar period, really. Just took a bit longer, happened a bit quicker, a bit more easily. Similar kind of conversion. And a big part of this was the Eurasian. So what I'm going to do is trace this development only from the perspective of civil society. There's so many different ways to look at this huge transition, but I'm going to try to look at it from the civil society perspective. What you're getting in the Philippines too, and in Indonesia, is the development of the importance of the Eurasian person, the mixed person. In Dutch, Indische. From about the mid-1800s, they're getting involved in writing, public writing, in organising, in publishing newspapers, and creating organisations. So now it all seems pretty straightforward, publish a newspaper. In 1850, this is a radical idea in the colony, okay? It's a radical idea. Have an organisation. Now it's quite easy to have an organisation. We could all set one up in the Trove any day. Back then, it's a radical idea as organisation. In 1200s England or 1200s China, you don't set up organisations with a secretary and a treasurer, right? You don't do that. This is a modern idea. And really, these Eurasian people, these Indische people, felt, as did all people in this colony, not to be part of a multicultural society, but part of a plural society. You don't mind going to the market and buying stuff and standing next to a Chinese person and buying stuff off a Japanese person. That's all okay. But they are different, like horses and cows and goats, okay? They're horses and cows and goats. They're the different kinds of people altogether. Does that make sense? You don't particularly hate them or anything, like we don't hate horses and goats particularly. They're useful, they do their role. You know, and in fact, probably these people didn't feel quite, they felt, sadly, they were influenced by the Dutch ideas and felt quite inferior to the Dutch. Most of their lives and struggles were to try to convince the Dutch they were as good as the Dutch. So they had a very big racial inferiority issue, which probably wouldn't have been a problem for the Japanese people, who were clearly superior to everybody else. Does that make sense? So in 1848, it's a small point in Indonesian history, but there was a public meeting and they advocated for the Indische people for education for European children. That means for mixed children too. That they should be educated. The meeting fizzled, and it was really, if you were standing outside the hall where it happened, you wouldn't realise, but I think this is a turning point in the history of Indonesia. This is the first kind of civil action that I know about. From it, we get press in the 1850s. This is from a book by Bosma and Raben that I've been talking about. It's influencing this lecture. Indische papers begin to express Indische views, which are basically, we want education for our children, we want job opportunities like those pure Dutch have. And we're sick of those top Dutch taking all the wealth, all the tobacco, all the coffee, all the tea, all the sugar from our colony to the motherland, i.e. Holland. We're sick of that, it's got to stop. But these are people who, they're not exactly, these are pen pushers. They're not the ones that are going to barricade themselves and set fire to the buildings or anything, because they probably work in those buildings, so they're not going to set fire to them, but anyway. So it's quite passive at this stage. And eventually, later, in the early 1900s, they formed Indy's party and its successors. And these expounded an idea of Indy's nationalism, which included Eurasians, and in principle Dutch long-term stayers, levers, people who stay in the colony long-term, as opposed to just come for a couple of years and head back, and Chinese Peranakan, mixed Chinese. So this is the first idea of nationalism. And it could have been this. In some sense, in the Philippines, that is the idea that took hold, a kind of mestizo nationalism. It was the mestizos, the Eurasian people, who pushed the nationalist agenda for so long there. But this idea of a Eurasian nation doesn't take off in Indonesia, and in fact disappeared by the 1950s. It's gone. As a group of people, they seem to have disappeared, gone one way or another, gone back to Holland or become Indonesians, and that's the end of it. But this is the earliest form of nationalism, a specific form of nationalism. No better or worse than any other form of nationalism. So there's the Eurasians, and we'll skip that. There's also Chinese organisations, particularly the Peranakan, the mixed Chinese, formed the first modern Chinese organisation, which is the THHK in 1900. And this enabled them to become modern, nationalist and Chinese. So their view of nationalism is again not, I'm the same kind of person as the guy down the road, because that guy down the road is like a horse to a goat. I'm like the other horses in China. Does that make sense? That's the kind of nationalism. And does this Kuo Yu mean anything to you, Young Bin? Does that Romanisation mean anything? Kuo Yu school system?
National language.
National language, okay. So I suppose Mandarin, is that right?
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Most of these Chinese, by the way, are speaking Hokkien and Teochew, which are Southeast Chinese languages.
Right.
And a lot of them still do, still today. In fact, even in my building, there are a couple of Chinese from Southeast Asia who still speak Hokkien and Teochew and cannot speak Mandarin.
Mm.
They were also organising boycotts against the Japanese and British for obvious reasons, because this is the period when Japan and Britain are both trying to, well, basically China for the first time in its history has lagged technologically, and Japan and England could take advantage of that and try and push their interests in China. So we've got two competing ideas of nationalism. Now we get to the point where most histories pick up, which is ethnic identity. There were indigenous ethnic organisations. Now you guys should know this. In Korea, there's probably just one language, Korean. In Japan, for the most part, there's one language, Nihongo, Japanese. We know in China there are many languages. So Korea is pretty much monocultural, monolingual. Japan, there are exceptions, monocultural, monolingual. Indonesia couldn't be more different. Hundreds of languages, hundreds of cultures. And then when you add all the other factors, like civilization, not civilization, literature, not literature, you have an incredibly diverse colony. And the early expressions of this are in indigenous ethnic organisations. Now, I just want you to look away for a second. I'm going to turn this off because I've got a really important point to make. We're talking from the 1870s. We're going, as I mentioned, from basically a series of trading outposts to a thoroughgoing empire, a colony that's really like an empire. So, on the one hand, the Dutch are coming out with their guns, their steamships and their railroads are just basically blasting their way through all of Indonesia. On the other hand, if you like, that's the left hand. On the right hand is the beautiful ethical policy which wants to give the Indonesians, so the Indonesians, on the one hand, they're killing them and wiping them out in Bali, in Aceh, all around Indonesia. On the other hand, they're handing out education, inoculation, housing, all kinds of things. It's quite an extraordinary thing that's going on here. And I can talk about that more in other units. Somebody's made sense of all of this, believe it or not. But for the meantime, we can use the pretty rigid idea of the left hand and the right hand of the state. One's got a machine gun, the other one's got it inoculating, okay? Don't understand how it all works, but that's how, yeah. Well, we can come up to, there is a theory to explain all this. So now they're educating, they're starting to educate firstly just the elite, the aristocratic elite, those Javanese again, those elite, they speak the same language as the people, the peasants in the village. Though mind you, when the peasants in the village talk to them, they have to use completely separate different words, different set of words than they would if they spoke to somebody at their own level. You know how the English king can say, we feel thirsty, instead of saying I feel thirsty. This pleases us not, meaning this pleases me not. There's one word that it's called the royal we. They can use a special pronoun to discuss themselves. In Javanese, there's a whole language, the whole set of vocabulary, every word. There's 2 words, 3 words for chair, 3 words for this, 3 words for person, 3 words for water, 3 words for watch. Does that make sense? One, we're using somebody at higher level, somebody at same level, somebody at lower level. So try and tell these Javanese elite, they're the same as those Javanese peasants they talk down to, literally talk down to. They use a lower dialect, basically, not dialect, lower set of words for everything. It's hard to believe. Imagine all the words you know need to know 2 other ones, 2 other versions for whatever version you're talking. So you're not going to convince them they belong to the same nation. So we've got a long way to go yet. It's going to happen pretty quickly. This stage, they're educating, the Dutch are educating the elite Javanese at schools they call Dr. Jawa. Doctor, obviously, Jawa means Javanese. High Javanese. They got together and decided, we'll form an organisation. They used a Javanese word which is Budi Otomo. Otomo means primary or number 1 or first. Budi, I think, means service. I can't remember. Budi. They decided to form a group of Budi Otomo. Following them, there are a whole lot of parties. We know about the Indish party, that's a Eurasian one from before. But you get words like Yong Ambon, they call themselves Yong Ambon, for the Ambonese people. The Minahasa people, another society, call themselves the Study Union. Sumatrans, which cover one island in Indonesia, have the idea of Sumatran youth. So this slide is a bit misleading. What I'm really talking about with ethnic organisations are Budi Otomo, Minahasa Study Union, and Yong Ambon. There are a lot of yongs, yong this, yong that, which is the yong being the Dutch word for what? Yong. So they're forming organisations, but the important thing is what language are they using to form the organisations? What language are they using to call themselves?
Bahasa.
They're using Dutch. Bahasa doesn't exist yet. There's no Bahasa Indonesia. There's no Bahasa Indonesia. There's a form of the Malay language that people speak, but these people can't speak it. These intellectuals cannot speak it. They probably speak a bit when they go shopping with those other people in the market. They can speak a bit of say 1, 2, give me, yes, thank you. That's about it. And even when they get together later, as I'll tell you, they can't speak Indonesian, as we know.
What's the language they spoke in the Japanese and they spread the one language?
By this stage, we're getting to Indonesian by 1940s. There's Budi Otomo back in that. Running short on time. Then you get religious organisations, particularly Islamic organisations. You have Sarekat Islam, Muhammadiyah, which is like a modern Islamic. Santri means strictly Islamic. Modern means modern. Santri traditional means strictly Islamic, but like in the traditional ways. Santri traditional, they'll wear batik. You know batik sarong? Santri modern, they'll wear pants and shoes. That makes sense? If you think about clothing-wise, you probably saw the difference back in those days. One's wearing batik and sarong, the other one's wearing pants and shoes. One wants to be modern, one wants to be traditional. But they're both pure, both stress that they're purely Islamic, okay? And they form organisations. Sarekat Islam doesn't really fit with one or the other, modern or traditional. It's actually basically a group of, it was like a group for traders, an organisation for traders and market traders. they then were overtaken by an intelligentsia, which was either Muslim or more socialist. So we have an Islamic group being taken over by Muslim reformists, modern Muslims and socialists. We're also getting communist and socialist organisations. The Indy Social Democratic Union, Syarikat Islam, which is eventually taken over by, by Marxists, by communists. So we're having this flourishing of movements, basically ethnic movements, religious movements, Eurasian movements, Chinese movements, Islamic movements. And this is all really tied up with the right hand of the Dutch government, which is giving and caring. By 1919, they said, all right, enough's enough. You guys are going crazy here. We won't have a colony much longer if you keep going this way. End. So now we're going through a period of restriction and control, which leads to actually communist uprisings, which the Dutch thoroughly suppress in 1926 and 27. Now the big moment, the kind of da-da moment, when it stops from being ethnic, religious, indigenous, ethnic, religious, Eurasian or Chinese, happens in 1928 at a Congress. And this is the big moment that Indonesians get pretty teary-eyed about still now, and you still have a day called Sumpah Oath Pemuda Youth Oath Day, Hari Sumpah Pemuda. It's still a big day. They got together and said, I think it was satu bahasa, satu negara, and satu something else. One language, one people, one, I can't remember what it was. And they're all going, Merdeka, Merdeka. Unfortunately, some of them didn't even know how to say this in the Malay language. So they couldn't even pronounce it properly. They knew Dutch very well, but they couldn't speak the Malay very well. So apparently it was all a bit confusing when they were trying to satu, okay, satu bahasa. They couldn't speak the language. That satu bahasa became Bahasa Indonesia. They said, okay, no more English, no more Dutch, no more Chinese, no more Kuao Yu or whatever, no more Budi Otomo, which is a Javanese word. Now we will be Indonesian, and it will encompass all of that. All that will be encompassed now. And we will be Indonesians. We'll speak one language. And it'll be, what is it called again? Oh yeah, Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia. How do you say it again? Bahasa, Bahasa. Okay, we'll use that one. Let's go and learn it now. They spoke Dutch, point is, or they spoke their own ethnic language, or Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, or whatever language was, better probably than they spoke this language. Probably the only people who spoke it reasonably well would have been the Eurasian people. Eurasian people were the only ones that spoke reasonably well. And this was led by a leadership of Sukarno, who would become Indonesia's first president, Hatta, who would become Indonesia's first president, and Syahrir, who had a rather less illustrious career. So when we're tracing, so we get up to 1928, and I'm going to leave it at 1928 actually. I'm not even going to get to the crucial part where they get together. The story after this is 1930s, there's a crackdown. Dutch society is quite calm. 1941 in December, something pretty full-on happens in the Pacific. Yeah, what happened in the Pacific, right in the middle of the Pacific?
World War II.
World War II's already started in 1939 in Europe. Pearl Harbor. Japan arrives on the scene with a pretty big bang. They destroy the US Pacific Fleet. What does that mean now? Who's going to protect these colonies? The Dutch have been wiped out by the Nazis. The English focused on their war in Europe. There are a few Australians in Singapore with their little Tommy guns or whatever. I don't know if you've ever seen the photos, it's amazing. there are these guys there, and you just see this sort of black cloud coming towards Singapore, and that's the Japanese. I mean, these probably, that's ranking up there in history as one of the most incredible invasions, the speed. And the fact is they were pretty much, could not be defeated, could not be defeated. Everything that, until the atomic bomb, or just until the war is finished and the US rebuilds its Pacific Fleet, everything that the English and the Australians threw at them was to no avail. They take over Indonesia. It's a pretty bloody ruthless time. If you support Japan, you can come out and Japan was making noises like about being anti-colonial, even though they really are. It's just another colonizer, right? It's just an Asian country's turn at being a colonizer. But they were very brutal, and particularly towards the Chinese. The Chinese got a shocking deal. But I mean, your average Indonesian just be picked up in the street, chucked on a truck, shipped off to Burma, forced to work, starves and dies, probably kicked off the road. The corpses probably still laying all around Burma. Terrible time. But one thing they did give the Indonesians was a sense of martial, military organisation, pride and strength, and trained them up. So when World War II was over, almost immediately after the atomic bomb, Indonesia declares independence, and there's not a lot the Dutch can do. Over 1945 to 47, they're trying to control this and saying, no, we don't recognise it. 1947 to 49, they send troops in. America says to the Dutch, forget about it, guys. If you want your money that we're giving to you post-World War II, give up on Indonesia. And the Dutch are like, okay, we'll give up. That's it, Indonesia's independent from 1949 on. There's a lot more to be said about nation building. All I've talked today is about how this early civil society, these organisations, started to develop the idea of Indonesia. And in fact, because some of them are saying this is where we're part of a Chinese nation, or we're part of an Indonesian nation, or that we're part of a Javanese nation, or that we're part of a Muslim nation. In other words, excluding many people who would then become Indonesian. I mean, we think the specific outlook of the organisation is not as important as the fact that there was an organisation that was printing, had a printing press, for example, had newspapers and was spreading the word. So we got back to this idea. So again, all I've looked at is a little part of this incredibly exciting and interesting phenomenon about how nationalism develops in one country, namely Indonesia. And we see this as a response to modernity. It's forced, in a sense, yes, to a certain extent, people all through this colony were part of what it was to be modern, but they also had been modernity thrust upon them, a European form of modernity thrust upon them, to which they had to respond. And this is part of the response. Civil society, particularly press and organisation. And this is part of the development of a national identity. After 1928, it becomes a nationalist agenda in terms of all the people in the colony, not just a certain group in the colony, all the people in the colony. Initially, there were competing ideas of what this would be and how it was imagined. All right, that's it for today. I think I was going to show a video which there won't be time for. Okay? Yeah. All right. This video is problematic.